Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of the Tibet Talks. Tibet Talks are conversation about Tibet with engaging thinkers, leaders, activists, and artists. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Christelle Genoud. Welcome, Christelle, to this new Tibet Talk.
Thanks for having me, Christelle.
Welcome. Let me briefly introduce you. So you are a research associate at King's College London, working on China's foreign interferences on academic freedom, which is a challenging topic. Until August 2021, you were human security advisor at the Embassy of Switzerland in Beijing, in charge of human rights and also Tibet. You have worked on human rights for about 10 years now, for the United Nations, for NGOs, for academia and the Swiss government, at headquarters and as well as on the field in Colombia, Palestine and Honduras. You hold a PhD on finance and human rights from the University of Lausanne. Today's Tibet Talk will focus on the topic of access to Tibet. As you are certainly all aware of, traveling to and within Tibet today remains a challenge. Most visit requests introduced by a foreign correspondent based in China, diplomats also based in the country, or even foreign delegations who are willing to visit Tibet, such as members of parliament or UN experts, are either rejected in general or simply ignored. Some foreigners, however, are still able to visit Tibet, in general in a private capacity, but it remains the exception. And Christelle is one of them. So you have been able to visit different parts of Tibet, including Sichuan, some part of Gansu, Qinghai, and Yunnan. So my first question to you is, in 2020, you have visited these different regions in Tibet as a diplomat and as a foreign tourist. Could you please explain to us the general dynamics of these trips?
Thank you, Vincent. So when speaking about access to Tibet, it's important to make the distinction between the Tibetan Autonomous Region and the 4 provinces you mentioned. Now, this division is imposed by the Chinese government, but concretely on the field, it translates by the fact that you need an authorization for TAR, while you don't need one for the 4 provinces you just mentioned. The fact that you need this authorization to visit TAR has kind of led to a confusion that maybe you need one to visit all the Tibetan areas, or that maybe because you don't need one for the 4 other provinces, there's nothing to see there. While obviously this is a mistake. But then there's still a caveat in the sense that even if you don't need an authorization to visit some part of Tibet, it doesn't mean that you're really going to have a free access or meaningful access, in the sense that authorities regularly try to prevent foreigners to visit, and when you're able to visit, you're going to be followed. In fact, we have noticed during the epidemic, COVID-19, that the epidemic was used as an excuse to close Tibet. It was, which Xinjiang, Tibet was one of the Tibetan Autonomous Region was one of the areas that was closed for the longest. And when I visited Sichuan, the first time, it coincided with the so-called second wave of cases in Beijing, which were only kind of dozens of cases. And this excuse was used by the local authorities to expel me from Sichuan.
Yeah, I think you're right to mention that accessing the TAR, Tibet Autonomous Region, requires a permit, and this is the only on authorization. It's the only region in China where it's the case. It shows also the level of control. I think that the region is, pacing. So could you also tell us more about the surveillance when visiting this area? This would be an interesting point.
Yes, it is. So I think that sometimes the extent of the measures taken by the local authorities to follow diplomats, journalists, or even foreign tourists can be quite puzzling. They will, I mean, you always think about China as a strong state, but sometimes there is kind of a sense of awkwardness or even maybe weakness in the way this surveillance is conducted when you visit Tibet. For example, it's not that difficult to spot reminders, even if they are plainclothes police. Sometimes you try to visit a monastery and they would come and tell you, oh, it's closed now, you cannot go, while it's clearly obvious that there are lots of tourists visiting at that moment. Or if you have a driver, they would openly call your driver when you are in the car with him to ask him, oh, where are you going now? Which road are you using, etc. So I think that this surveillance is more and more open, and it also aims to intimidate. For example, sometimes our minders would openly film us or take picture of us at very close range to kind of send us a message that we are watching you. But in the end, I think that this surveillance is more dangerous for the Tibetans with whom you interact than for you as a foreigner.
And obviously on you, this intimidation did not work because you continue to visit the other parts of Tibet as well. So, and I think maybe before continuing, it would be good to have a map shown on the screen to a little bit remind the different parts of Tibet that we mentioned, where they are. So when we speak about Tibet, you see there are here different colors. If you take the dark red colors, this is what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region. And this is an entity, an administrative entity that was created in 1965. And this covers 1.2 million square kilometers. But if you take I would say the historical Tibet, which ICT also is in line with, it's much bigger, and it's also includes the other part in a lighter red area in the east part of Tibet, of the Thar. And this all together, all the Tibet covers superficie of 2.5 million square meters, and half of the Tibetan population of 6 million people together live in the Thar. So you have also many Tibetans who are in Amdo and Kham. And these are the names that Tibetans use to when they speak about Tibet. You have Utsang, you have Amdo and Kham, the three regions, traditional regions that Tibetan speak about. You have mentioned that you have been to Sichuan, Gansu, Qinghai, and Yunnan, but if I'm correct, you have not been to the Tibet Autonomous Region. Could you explain us why, please?
Yeah, that is correct, Vincent. So as you explained very well, you need this authorization to go to Thar. And depending on the political context, it can often be quite difficult to get it. Again, Thar was closed for a year and a half during COVID. But more importantly, even when you get this authorization, then you have to travel with a designated travel agency, which will put together a tour for you, and it's kind of the same tour for everybody, and you don't have lots of room of maneuver to choose what you want to visit. So in that context, of course, there are still pros and cons about going. The government still can't control everything, and you might get a sense of a bit what's going on there. But on the other hand, going on this organized tour, it's also we have to acknowledge that it's also a way for the Chinese government to show you what they want you to see. And as long as there are enough foreigners who agree to visit Thar under this format, then there's not a lot of incentive for the Chinese government to grant real access. Because the numbers of foreigners going on those organized tours to say, oh, you see, TAR is open. We had that number of visitors, so that's why I think if you decide to go to TAR on those visits, then you have a responsibility with what you do with this visit.
I fully agree. I think our stand at ICT is indeed always to say to either to individuals or to delegation officials, go and visit Tibet, request visits. You have to, as much as possible, go on the ground. And indeed, if you have orchestrated or controlled tour, it's important, for instance, for foreign delegation to negotiate in advance where you go, to be firm in asking some areas or meet people that you want to meet, to also control your communication, which is important because indeed Chinese officials and media will also manipulate the visit in their interest. So I think this is part of the game that is there taking place. You mentioned earlier that it could be risky also for like the driver or some Tibetans that you meet or to interact with if you are a foreigner visiting Tibet. And I wanted to know if yourselves you were able to meet and discuss with Tibetans and to collect, for instance, some personal feelings and testimonies, or not at all because it's too risky.
So as you mentioned, because of this surveillance, you always have to have in mind that there might be a risk for the Tibetans you are trying to interact with. In monasteries, for example, there are cameras everywhere, and you can feel that the monks and nuns are under a lot of pressure. In those big monasteries that are on tourism tour, the only interaction you can have is the organized interaction, for example, when they give you an organized tour, but there is no room of maneuver for spontaneous or substantive interaction, or not a lot. Then in more remote areas, it can be different depending on whether you're followed or not. I think that in these remote areas, it's more complicated for the government to implement the same kind of surveillance they do on tourist tours, for example. And I think it's also why there are all those plans about resettlements. It's because resettling people who are in remote areas is also a way to control them better. For example, when I visited the house of a herder in one of these remote areas, he had a picture of the Dalai Lama, which is forbidden in China. And so I was surprised, and I asked him, are you not afraid to have this picture? And he said, oh, but if the local authorities or the police come, I will see them arriving and I can just hide the picture. So it's not a big deal. Whereas something like that in monasteries, having pictures of the Dalai Lama, it's hardly possible. Even if the monks would like to worship the Dalai Lama, they would be punished if they have a picture of him.
It's of course difficult to visit Tibet as a foreigner, or it's limited. But I think there is the tourism of Han Chinese is stimulated, encouraged by the government, who wants to generate profit, or also use tourism as a way to show a positive image of Tibet, of the monastery, of the landscape. So there is a certain here ambiguity between both, I think. And I remember when I visited Tibet, the Tibet Autonomous Region in 2007, I saw many Han Chinese tourists already at that time in Lhasa and Chigatse. And when I remember in the Jokang Temple in Lhasa, there was a guide with a group of Chinese visitors who was giving his explanation very loudly, almost shouting. And this, despite the fact that there were monks praying in the middle of the temple. So there was, I witnessed real lack of consideration and respect for these monks and for their prayers. And I think that's also why this picture is you can see this picture of tourists taking pictures of monks in Tibet. I also remember I visited the Sera monastery, and there was every day at a certain hour there are philosophical debates that are taking place. And at that time, buses of tourists also arrive, and they can go in the courtyard and take picture of monks who are debating. And this is also like not a very, I would say, appropriate atmosphere for such debates and philosophical debates. So my question is, when you visited these regions of Sichuan, Qinghai, Gansu, and Yunnan, what were your observations in terms of tourism development in Tibet?
No, I think the examples you just mentioned are illustrate a broader tendency, which is really this tension between tourism development and the repression of human rights, and especially cultural rights and freedom of religion. Because on the one hand, you have the Chinese government promoting tourism as a way to develop Tibet. Lots of infrastructures have been built. Lots of subsidies are dedicated to railroads, etc., in order to facilitate access to the region. And this tourism is based not only on the beauty of a cultural landscape or rural life, but also on Tibetan culture or part of the Tibetan culture. And there is also this narrative of the Chinese government as championing economic, social, and cultural rights. But then, on the other hand, the vision of culture that is promoted by the Chinese government is very limited and flawed. There is the erasure of part of the Tibetan culture that the government deems as threatening its stability or its national interest. For example, the figure of the Dalai Lama, as we mentioned, while it's the spiritual leader and an important part of the Tibetan culture, you can see him nowhere in monasteries. And monasteries have also been at the forefront of demands for real autonomy. But of course, when you visit monasteries with the organized tour, they're never going to mention that. And then there is also a second aspect, which is the commercialization of spiritual life through tourism. For example, in the Kumbum monastery, you could see lots of monks who were busy with the queue managing, playing instruments for money, teaching tourists to pray, selling yak butter candles, etc. And one of the monks told me that those commercial activities were taking him most of his time to the detriment of spiritual life. And the last element I would like to mention is that the promotion of tourism is also a way for the government to convey his vision of history. For example, through museums. There are lots of museums in the Tibetan areas that depict the arrival of the People Liberation Army as a liberation, as a peaceful liberation, or Tibetan Buddhism as a traditional part of Chinese culture. So there is a lot at stake around this narrative and history.
Yeah, your observation meet what we observe at ICT is that there is a growing control over Tibetan Buddhism, or in particular since a couple of last years, since President Xi Jinping is heading the state. What we really monitor is that try to limit the number of monks and nuns that are, able to be in the monasteries. They have management committee that are, managing the monasteries with members of the Communist Party. There is a control of sometimes with police station nearby the monastery or within the monastery. So all that is for us creating really what we call a Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. Despite the fact that it's happening, we still, encourage people to visit Tibet. And I would like to ask you if you had any advice to tell visitors who would like to visit Tibet, what would they be?
I think that your political guide, the international political guide, is a good start. In overall, I think that if you visit Tibet, you can easily think that, well, in the end, it's okay. I mean, there are Tibetan books in libraries, there are monasteries that are open, there are prayer flags outside, so it's not that bad. But you have to understand that what you see, those apparent freedom, are very much controlled by the Chinese government. And all those practices remain within what is tolerated by the government. And there is a fine line that Tibetan cannot cross, and this is what is more difficult to see. So it's not only about monasteries being open or renovated, it's about how many monks are there now in comparison with before. The fact, as you mentioned, that there is this Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism, which means that spiritual leaders are pressured to teach Buddhism in a certain way. And all these things are more difficult to see, so I would advise a lot of reading before going, in order just not to be fooled by the Chinese government allows you to see.
Exactly, and I think you need to decode, to interpret what is shown to you. And I remember at ICT we published some years back a new report that was entitled "Interpreting Tibet: How to Decode Reality That Is Shown to You." Before we continue, I see a question from one of our auditor who asked this: is it likely, in your view, that one still obtains the permit to visit and to travel to the Tibet Autonomous Region if she or he criticizes the Chinese politics? What do you think of this question?
I think that if, there is a check, of course. If you are a journalist who has been very vocal on Tibet and criticizing the policies there, it might be complicated. But honestly, the way the authorization are granted is not very predictable, so it's always good to try.
In October this year, China announced that Wang Yongshen was appointed as the party secretary, the new party secretary in the Tibet Autonomous Regional Committee. We see a picture of him now on the screen. And previously, he was the secretary of the party committee of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is a state-owned economic and paramilitary organization. And Wang has been accused of perpetrating human rights violation against the Uyghur people in East Turkestan. Therefore, the European Union, together with the United States, Canada and the United Kingdom, all place Wang on their sanction list for human rights violation in East Turkestan. For ICT, we think that this new nomination in the TAR indicates that the Chinese authorities want to continue their repressive policies on the Tibetan people. So, Christelle, you have also visited East Turkestan. What are, in your views, the differences and the commonalities with the situation in Tibet?
So I think that the main commonality is really the fact that in both region you have this plan of Sinicizing minorities. And with the growing attention on Xinjiang, people have tended to forget about Tibet, but these two issues are very much linked and intricated, although not everything is comparable, of course. But when I visited, I found that in both regions, there's really a plan from the Chinese government to attract tourism and show them a construction of this new so-called new old towns where everything is nice and you can go there without any problem. But this is a very limited vision of culture. And if you try to get outside of those designated places where everything is kind of like a small Disneyland, then it's a bit more sensitive. Of course. For example, when I went to Xinjiang, we visited those so-called new old towns easily. And then when you try to go to, for example, industrial park, where you have, where camps, prisons, and schools have been identified in the same areas, then you see that it's way more sensitive. For example, fake car accidents were staged on our way there in order to block the road and prevent us from going. And once we were there, it was really sensitive to take picture, and sometimes they try to have us erase the picture. And of course, in these two regions, the Uyghurs and the Tibetans are under lots of pressure, and it's also very much putting them at risk sometimes to try to interact with them.
Thank you for your comparing the two regions. I would like now to discuss about next year's Winter Olympic Games that will take place in China. This will take place in February 2022. So there is a small mistake in the title of this slide. We have released a new briefing entitled "Olympic Descent: Repression in Tibet since Beijing 2008." And our report documents how the Chinese government has increased its repression in Tibet since hosting the 2008 Olympics, despite the fact that China's official said they would use the games and after improve human rights and social conditions in the country. And I think we all remember that in 2008 there were important uprisings on the Tibetan plateau everywhere to, criticize Chinese policy in the region. The filmmaker Dondup Wangshen, who was jailed 6 years for his documentary Leaving Fear Behind, in which he interviews Tibetans on their views and grievances about the 2008 Olympics, has just started a tour in Europe. He's coming in a few days to Belgium, and he will visit during his 2 months tour almost 15 European countries. I think he wants to of course, explain his personal experience, but also raise the human rights situation in Tibet. And also his point of view is that China does not deserve the honor of hosting the 2022 Winter Games. And he asked IOC to withdraw its athletes. At ICT, our position is to call for a diplomatic boycott of the Games, so there are different stands on this issue. And I would like to know from you, Christelle, with regard to the human rights situation in Tibet as well as in China in general, what is your opinion on the boycott of the Winter Olympic Games next year?
So I think you're right to mention that the 2008 Olympic Games did not improve the human rights situation in China despite all the promises. And I would even add that in fact, it had negative consequences on the human rights situation. When you think, for example, about Tibet and Xinjiang, where security measures were implemented in the run-up to the Olympic Games, this also had an influence on the 2008 protests in Tibet and the 2009 protests in Xinjiang. But so now we are in this suboptimal situation with the 2022 Olympics. And in that context, for me, a diplomatic boycott is really the minimum. The Olympic Committee has long taken a position that sport is separate from the politics of the countries. But in China, as in many countries, sport and politics are very much intertwined. And I think that the recent case of the tennis woman, the Olympic Committee has been dealing with human rights accusation. But so now, at least in the run-up of the Olympics, we still have an opportunity to put some pressure on the Chinese government. For example, for the release of human rights defenders, although the closer we get to the starting date, the less inclined the government will probably be to make concessions in order not to appear weak. And maybe the fact that there has been so much uncertainty about the format of the games and the postponements of the Tokyo Olympics has kind of diluted the attention for sufficient pressure, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you that sports and politics are interlinked. And at that level, when this kind of event happened, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to use the Olympics as a vitrine, as to show how prestigious and big China is with its athletes and so on. So I think we have here for the visit of Dom Wangshen, we have asked a meeting with the Belgian Olympic Committee. We haven't had any positive answer, so we'll continue. But it shows also how reluctant they are to face their responsibility of also raising human rights issue at the national level and also at the International Olympic Committee level, and express their statement about the human rights degradation on the ground. Before concluding this Tibet conversation and talk, I would like to know if there is also we are asking this to our guests, if there a book or movie on Tibet or China that you would recommend to our auditors.
So about Tibet, I would highly recommend the book of Barbara Demick, Eat the Buddha. You had her on your Tibet talk recently. It really helped me to have some background on historical facts before visiting Tibet, because you always have this narrative of the Chinese government that before the arrival of the People Liberation Army, Tibet was a very feudal society and lots of inequalities, huge violations of human rights. And these books shows the limits of this narrative. And about China, human rights in China, I would also highly recommend the book Human Rights in China from Eva Pils, which give you a sense of human rights in China's authoritarian regime. And I have the pleasure to currently work with Eva Pils on a project called Academic Freedom Scholarship and the rise of China's authoritarianism, where we look at the influence of authoritarian regime on academic freedom in democratic systems.
Yeah, this is a very pertinent issue that we are also trying to follow. It's not easy, but we see how China is trying to influence the academic freedom in our country, also in my former universities like College of Europe or Université Libre de Bruxelles, with Confucius Institute or Chinese professors there trying to influence the debate. Well, on this, thank you for your concrete recommendations. The book of Barbara is excellent, and I really call all of you to read it if you have not done so. I think your experience in Tibet on the ground has been useful to a little bit decode what's happening there. It's inspiring. It gives us some direct testimonies on the situation on the ground. So thank you very much for your presence today. And I would say that if you have enjoyed this discussion, we also invite you to join us next week on December 1st. We will have a Tibet talk on French EU presidency that is starting next year on 1st of January. And we will have members of the European Parliament. Mr. Raphaël Glucksmann will be with us. And also from the French Parliament, Madame Eustache Brignot will be there. She's heading the Tibet group in the Senate, as well as Michael Van Wal, who is a researcher and has written an excellent book on Tibet. So this is for next week. Thank you again for your participation, Christelle, and I wish you all the best. Thank you, and thank you for your attention tour. Goodbye.
Thank you, Vincent.